Welcome back, Focus Learners, to this explainer. So today, we are unpacking one of the oldest stories ever told. We're looking at the Odyssey. But we aren't just looking at it as some ancient 3,000-year-old myth. No, this is actually the ultimate cautionary tale of unchecked ego and the massive, devastating butterfly effect that a single moment of pride can cause.
Seriously, how did the smartest guy in ancient Greece manage to outsmart himself for an entire decade? I mean, think about it for a second. Odysseus is the absolute genius who ended the brutal 10-year Trojan War. He's the one who came up with the brilliant tactical idea to hide soldiers inside a giant wooden horse. And yet, somehow, this mastermind managed to completely and utterly ruin his own journey back to his home in Ithaca.
Okay, let's dive into this, because the math here is just completely absurd. He had just spent 10 agonizing years fighting in Troy. His journey back across the sea to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, it should have been a super straightforward trip. We're talking maybe 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Instead, it morphed into a 10-year nightmare journey packed with monsters, furious gods, and just constant, unending disaster. And the stakes for this trip were absolutely massive. When Odysseus finally left Troy, he didn't just hop on a boat alone. He commanded a massive fleet of 12 ships and over 600 men. That is essentially a small army under his direct care, all of them looking to their brilliant commanding officer to navigate them safely back to their families.
But here's the kicker. Despite that massive responsibility, the survival rate was literally zero. After dealing with early disasters, like his crew ignoring strict orders and getting 72 men killed by the Circones on day 1, and then having to actually drag his scouts crying away from the memory-erasing Lotus Eaters, absolutely zero of those 600 men made it back alive. Not a single one. So what went so disastrously wrong?
Well, it all boils down to the inciting incident, the Cave of Polyphemus. The major turning point of this entire epic wasn't some unavoidable fate orchestrated by the cosmos. No, it was a single, entirely avoidable mistake made inside the cave of a one-eyed giant. Odysseus and 12 of his best men were trapped in this cave by the Cyclops Polyphemus, who rolled a boulder over the door so heavy that 22 wagons couldn't have moved it. And then, the giant just started eating the crew raw for breakfast.
So we have this crazy contrast. On one hand, you've got his absolute tactical brains. He gets the Cyclops incredibly drunk, tells him his name is Nobody, and blinds the giant with a sharpened olive stake. When the other Cyclops ask who is hurting him, Polyphemus yells out, "Nobody is hurting me." It's a genius escape. They sneak out the next morning, strapped under the bellies of the giant's sheep. But just as they're safely sailing away, Odysseus suffers a catastrophic lack of impulse control. His ego takes the wheel. He just had to take the credit. Actually, scratch that. He couldn't help himself. He turns back and shouts his real name, Odysseus, King of Ithaca.
And because he shouted his real name, the blinded Polyphemus knew exactly who to pray to, begging his father, make sure Odysseus never gets home. You see, Polyphemus wasn't just some random monster. He was the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea. By claiming the credit, Odysseus triggered a divine curse that literally made the ocean itself his absolute worst enemy.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how rapidly this curse triggers a compounding downward spiral. It's just one thing after another. First, King Aeolus gives him a bag containing all the dangerous winds to help him get home safely. But his greedy crew opens it while he's sleeping, blowing them completely off course. Then they run into the Lastrygonians, these massive giants who hurl boulders from the cliffs, destroying 11 of his 12 ships and eating hundreds of men. Next up is Circe's island, where the witch goddess turns his surviving crew into actual pigs. Thankfully, the god Hermes gave Odysseus a magical plant to beat Circe's magic, but they still wound up stuck on her island for a whole year.
Eventually, Circe drops a bomb on him. She tells him he can't just sail home. He has to sail to the very edge of the world, down to the underworld, to consult the dead. And this is where the consequences of his actions get incredibly personal. While summoning spirits, he sees his own mother. She had died of grief, waiting for him to come home, a direct casualty of his ego. He tries to embrace her, but she just slips through his arms like a shadow. He also meets the blind prophet Tiresias, who gives him one strict, deadly warning. Do not, under any circumstances, touch the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. So, leaving the underworld, Odysseus and his one remaining ship have to run this terrifying, high-stakes gauntlet of sea monsters. First, the sirens, whose beautiful voices lure sailors to crash on the rocks. Odysseus survives by ordering his crew to plug their ears with beeswax and having himself tied tightly to the mast. Next, they face an impossible choice between Charybdis, a massive ship-swallowing whirlpool, and Scylla, a horrifying six-headed monster. Odysseus chooses Scylla, knowing mathematically he has to sacrifice 6 men rather than lose the whole ship. And as the monster snatched those 6 sailors up, they literally died screaming his name.
Which leads them right directly to the one island Tiresias explicitly warned him about, the home of the cattle of Helios. Bad winds trapped them on this beach for an entire month. The food ran out, the men were starving. And while Odysseus was asleep, his desperate crew decided they'd rather risk the wrath of the gods than starve to death on a beach. Completely ignoring the prophet's warning, they slaughtered the sacred cattle.
Man, when Odysseus woke up and smelled roasting beef, he knew they were finished. As soon as they set sail, the wrath of the gods fell upon them with absolutely brutal force. Zeus hurled a thunderbolt that split their one remaining ship completely in half. Every single member of the crew drowned in the sea. Over 600 men started this journey. Now only Odysseus survived, clinging desperately to the wreckage.
He drifted until he washed up on the island of Ogygia. Here, the nymph goddess Calypso fell in love with him and kept him captive for 7 agonizing years. She even offered him the ultimate prize, immortality, if he would just stay with her forever. But Odysseus rejected it. He sat on the beach every single day, staring at the horizon and just crying for his home. Finally, the goddess Athena intervened and convinced Zeus to force Calypso to release him.
But hang on, while he was trapped on that island, let's look at what was going down back home in Ithaca. Because a 20-year disaster was unfolding in his own palace. Assuming the king was dead, 108 men from the surrounding islands had practically invaded his home. These suitors were eating his food, drinking his wine, and constantly harassing his wife Penelope, trying to force her to marry one of them so they could take the throne.
And this brilliantly illustrates that Odysseus wasn't the only strategic genius in this marriage. Penelope matched her husband's intellect with one of the greatest stalling tactics in history. Step 1, she promised to choose a suitor only after she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus' father, which she diligently wove in plain sight every single day. Step 2, every single night she secretly unraveled the entire thing. She successfully gaslit 108 aggressive men for 3 full years before a servant finally betrayed her secret.
Finally, after surviving Poseidon smashing his makeshift raft yet again, Odysseus is given a ship by the Phaeacians and wakes up on the beaches of Ithaca. 20 years later, the king is home. But he can't just walk through the front door. Athena disguises him as an old, frail beggar so he can infiltrate his own home without being recognized. He has to endure horrible abuse from the suitors. They mock him, they treat him like garbage, one even throws a stool right at his head. But Odysseus takes it all in stride, silently watching, counting, and scouting his enemies.
Right before the climax of this epic, though, there's a detail that profoundly grounds this narrative emotionally. As he enters the palace gates in his disguise, he walks past an ancient, neglected dog lying on a pile of manure. It's Argos, the hunting dog Odysseus raised as a puppy 2 decades ago. Despite the rags and the magic disguise, Argos knows his master. The loyal dog manages to lay his ears flat and wag his tail one last time, and then he dies. He had waited 20 years just to see his master come home.
Inside the palace, Penelope announces her final challenge. She will marry the man who can string Odysseus' great bow and shoot a single arrow clean through the narrow heads of 12 axes lined up in a row. It is an impossible contest of strength and skill. One by one, the suitors try, and not a single one can even bend the bow. Then, the old beggar asks for a turn. The suitors laugh, but the disguised Odysseus takes the weapon, strings it like it's absolutely nothing, and fires an arrow perfectly through all 12 axes. The second that arrow flies, everything shifts. Odysseus turns the great bow on the suitors, drops his disguise, and delivers this chilling line. You thought your king was dead, you devoured his home, you harassed his wife, and now pay for all of it. Alongside his son Telemachus, whom he had left as an infant, Odysseus locks the doors. What follows is an absolute bloodbath. They execute all 108 suitors right there in the Great Hall.
But, even after the bloodbath, Penelope needs to be absolutely sure. 20 years is a long time, and gods use disguises, right? So she devises this brilliant final test. She casually tells her servants to move the king's bed out of the bedroom. Odysseus immediately snaps, revealing a secret only the 2 of them know. The bed physically cannot be moved. He built it himself, carving one of the bedposts out of a living olive tree that is still deeply rooted into the earth. With that, Penelope finally knows it's truly him, and they are reunited. As we bring this explainer to a close, let's just take a step back and look at the ultimate cost of ego here. 20 years lost, 2 wars fought, a curse from the god of the sea, 6-headed monsters, witches, and a decade of defending a home from violent invaders. And as we've seen, this entire 10-year nightmare journey directly connects back to that one single, prideful mistake in the Cyclops gave. He had escaped, but he just had to yell his name so he could get the credit.
Which leaves us with this really powerful, resonant thought. The smartest person in the room can still be the dumbest person in the room if they can't control their ego. Odysseus survived because of his tactical brilliance for sure, but he lost a decade of his life and over 600 of his men simply because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. It makes you wonder, in our own lives and careers, when is our intense need for recognition actually our biggest liability? Thank you for exploring this fascinating source material with me today. Keep learning, stay focused, and always remember to keep that ego in check.
All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a story that is literally 3,000 years old. But man, the core lesson here is as modern as it gets. We're looking at how a brilliant military mind, a legendary tactician, managed to turn a quick 2-week trip into a 10-year nightmare. And the truly fascinating part? He didn't do it because he was outmatched by some brilliant enemy. He did it simply because he couldn't control his own ego. So let's jump right in. Picture this. The Trojan War is just wrapped up. The Greeks have been camped outside the walls of Troy on the coast of modern-day Turkey for a full decade. And the man of the hour was absolutely Odysseus. I mean, he had just won the entire war with his genius idea to build a giant wooden Trojan horse, hide soldiers inside, and leave it as a gift. The tactic worked perfectly. Troy fell, and Odysseus was hailed as the ultimate hero. At this point, heading back to his island home of Ithaca to see his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus should have been a super straightforward voyage. We're talking maybe 14 days. Instead, it devolved into this legendary 10-year nightmare filled with monsters, angry gods, and just relentless disaster. But before we get into the literal sea monsters, the devastating shipwrecks, and the wrath of literal gods, we really have to pause and ask ourselves a fundamental question. How exactly did the mastermind behind the fall of Troy manage to derail his own life so spectacularly? Like, how does a certified genius make such a colossal mess of things?
Section 1. A 10-year mistake.
To truly grasp the sheer magnitude of what was lost during this horrific journey, we really have to look at the baseline numbers. Our hero left the coast of modern-day Turkey with a massive, formidable fleet. We're talking 12 sturdy ships and well over 600 battle-hardened guys. But the ultimate cost of this journey was absolute. By the time Odysseus finally sets foot on Ithaca again, he has 0 ships, 0 crew left. Not a single one of those men who celebrated that massive victory at Troy made it back home alive.
And the chaos for this giant fleet starts literally on day 1. Odysseus tells his men to get back on the ships after raiding the city of Ismarus, but they totally ignore his orders and decide to just party on the beach instead. Well, the next morning, the locals return with reinforcements, and 72 soldiers, 6 from each of the 12 ships, are killed. Almost immediately after that tragedy, a storm blows them over to the island of the Lotus Eaters. Here, 3 scouts eat these magical lotus flowers that completely wipe their memories. They forget their homes, their families, their entire identities, and literally have to be dragged back to the boats crying.
Section 2. The Ego Trap.
Now, those earlier stumbles, they were just a warm-up compared to the true inciting incident. The single, catastrophic pivot point that sealed his face and triggered a decade of absolute horror actually went down inside a cheese-filled cave. Odysseus and 12 of his best men wander into this cave, only to discover it belongs to Polyphemus. This guy is a one-eyed, giant, man-eating Cyclops who also happens to be the son of Poseidon. The Cyclops traps them by rolling this massive boulder over the entrance, a rock so heavy that 22 wagons couldn't budge it. He then casually proceeds to smash 2 men on the ground and eat them raw for breakfast. Knowing he can't just kill the giant, because then they'd be trapped forever behind the boulder, Odysseus uses his supreme intellect. He gets the monster completely drunk on wine and introduces himself as nobody. When the Cyclops passes out, Odysseus blinds him with a heated olive stake. The monster starts screaming, and when the neighboring Cyclopes run over to ask who's hurting him, Polyphemus yells, "Nobody is hurting me." So they all just shrug and leave.
This moment brilliantly illustrates the guy's dual nature. On one hand, he's a strategic genius, right? He was smart enough to hide his identity as nobody. And then, in the morning, he straps his surviving men to the bellies of the giant's sheep so they can escape the cave totally undetected. Honestly, if he had just sailed away right then, that would have been the end of the story. But his pride simply wouldn't let him leave quietly. He desperately needed the credit. So, as his ship pulls away, he makes a profoundly foolish mistake.
He stands up and literally screams his real name, his father's name, and his royal title right back at the blinded giant.
And because Polyphemus finally had a real name to work with, he did exactly what you'd expect. He prayed to his incredibly powerful father. Poseidon, the god of the sea, heard that prayer and granted a devastating curse. He ensured that Odysseus would either never reach home at all, or if he somehow managed to survive against all odds, he'd arrive years late, completely broken, entirely alone, and to a house full of trouble. From that specific moment on, the very ocean they were sailing on basically became Odysseus's personal enemy.
Section 3. A Decade of Disasters.
From that one moment of unbridled ego stems a rapid-fire sequence of absolute chaos. The snowballing fallout here is just staggering. First, they're gifted a leather bag holding all the dangerous storm winds. They sail perfectly for 9 days, and literally, just as the smoke from the chimneys of Ithaca is visible, Odysseus falls asleep. His crew, convinced the bag is full of secret gold, tears it open, and they are instantly blown all the way back across the sea. Next up, giant cannibals called Lastrygonians hurl boulders off cliffs and completely destroy 11 of his 12 ships. Then, they land on an island where the witch goddess Circe turns his scouting party into actual pigs, complete with snouts and hooves, delaying them for an entire year. Finally, to navigate past a massive whirlpool called Charybdis, Odysseus actively chooses to sail near a 6-headed monster named Scylla. He has to sacrifice 6 of his own men who are eaten alive while screaming his name.
Even a magical trip to the edge of the world brings nothing but pain. Odysseus is forced to dig a pit of blood to summon the dead, just so he can speak with the blind prophet Tiresias. The prophet gives him one strict, extremely clear warning. Whatever you do, do not touch the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. But the real gut punch here is personal. While he's down in the underworld, Odysseus sees his own mother's ghost. She had died of a broken heart, just waiting for him to come home. He tries to physically embrace her 3 separate times, but she just slips through his arms like a shadow. That right there, that is the true, devastating cost of his ego.
But of course, the nightmare continues. Bad winds trap the crew on the island of the sun god, and they completely run out of food. While Odysseus is sleeping, his starving men decide they'd rather face the wrath of the gods later than starve today. So they slaughter the sacred cattle. When Odysseus wakes up, he is greeted by this absolute horror show. The hides of the dead cattle are literally crawling along the ground, and the meat roasting on the spits is mooing. The second they set sail again, Zeus steps in and splits their final ship in half with a thunderbolt, drowning every single remaining man.
So now he is entirely alone. 0 ships, 0 crew. Our so-called smartest man alive washes up on the island of Ogygia. He spends the next 7 years stranded there with the goddess Calypso. She falls completely in love with him and even offers him immortality, but he refuses it. Instead, he spends 7 long years just sitting on a beach, staring out at the horizon, crying his eyes out. He's stuck there until the goddess Athena finally convinces Zeus to step in and force his release.
Section 4. The Return to Ithaca.
After a grand total of 20 years away, 10 fighting the Trojan War and 10 fighting the sea, he washes up in Phaeocia, where a sympathetic king finally hooks him up with a ship home. But remember Poseidon's curse? True to the sea god's word, Odysseus arrives broken, entirely alone, and to a house completely full of trouble. And by trouble, I mean 108 suitors. These guys from surrounding islands have basically assumed Odysseus is dead and have completely taken over his palace. They are eating his food, drinking all his wine, casually plotting to kill his son, and aggressively trying to force his wife, Penelope, to marry one of them. It is a full-blown invasion of his home.
But Penelope proves she is absolutely a perfect match for her husband's renowned intellect. She holds off these invaders using what has got to be one of the greatest stalling tactics in history. Step 1. She promises to choose a new husband only after she finishes weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father. Step 2. She weaves this incredibly intricate shroud in the main hall every single day where everyone can see her. Step 3. She secretly unravels all her work every single night. She manages to stall 108 aggressive, impatient men for 3 full years with this trick before a servant finally betrays her secret.
Knowing he obviously can't fight 108 men head-on, Athena disguises Odysseus as an old, ragged beggar. And as he walks through his own gates, he experiences this incredibly heartbreaking moment. His ancient hunting dog, Argos, lying on a pile of manure, recognizes him. The dog wags his tail, lays his ears flat, and finally passes away, having stayed alive for 20 years just to see his master one last time. Inside the hall, the suitors mercilessly mock the disguised beggar.
One of them even throws a stool right at his head. But showing some massive character growth, Odysseus keeps his mouth shut this time. He endures the humiliation, quietly watching, counting, and plotting his revenge.
The climax finally hits when Penelope announces a contest. Whoever can string Odysseus's massive great bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through 12 axe heads will win her hand. The suitors try, but they can't even bend the bow. But then the old beggar steps up. He effortlessly strings it and fires the arrow perfectly through all 12 axes. He then turns the bow directly on the suitors, drops the beggar disguise, and says, "You thought your king was dead, and now pay for all of it." Alongside his son Telemachus, he slaughters all 108 men right there in the Great Hall.
But even after a literal bloodbath, Penelope remains super careful. 20 years is a long time, and she needs one final test to be sure it's really him. So she casually asks a servant to move the king's bed out of the bedroom. Odysseus immediately snaps at her, saying the bed is totally immovable because he built it himself, using a living, rooted olive tree as one of the bedposts. It's an intimate secret only the real Odysseus could possibly know. He passes the test, finally proving his identity, and they are reunited at last after 2 wars, witches, and a decade of greedy suitors.
Section 5. The Ultimate Lesson.
So, after exploring all the insane twists and turns of this nearly 3,000-year-old story, what is the core thesis of today's explainer? The ultimate takeaway here is that your intelligence and your strategic brilliance are completely useless if you're blinded by your own pride and this insatiable need for credit. Odysseus outsmarted a Cyclops. He resisted the sirens. He even navigated the land of the dead. But it took him 10 agonizing years to learn the one thing he should have known right from the start. Sometimes the absolute smartest move you can make is just keeping your mouth shut.
I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on today. Take a hard look at your own life and your own interactions. When was the last time your inability to just walk away quietly ended up costing you dearly? When was the last time you let your ego turn a simple 2-week inconvenience into your own personal 10-year nightmare? Just keep that in mind the next time you feel that desperate need to make sure everyone in the room knows exactly how smart you are. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.
For a decade, the Greek army sat stranded outside the stone walls of Troy. They couldn't breach the defenses, and the Trojans wouldn't leave. The military stalemate seemed permanent, but the man who finally cracked the city open didn't do it with a sword. Odysseus did it with an idea. He recognized that brute force was useless against an impregnable fortress. He built a giant wooden horse, hid his best soldiers inside, and left it as a gift. He knew human psychology. They wouldn't check inside. That night, the Greeks climbed out, opened the gates, and burned the city to the ground. With the war over, Odysseus was a hero. He had 12 ships, over 600 veteran soldiers, and a massive fortune in treasure. All he had to do was cross the Aegean Sea back to his island of Ithaca. Looking at a map, it's a straightforward route straight across the water. It should have taken 2 weeks. Instead, not one man made it home. Every ship was obliterated. That 2-week commute devolved into a 10-year nightmare of shipwrecks, mutinies, and angry gods. Odysseus spent a decade in misery because his own ego turned a 2-week victory lap into a 10-year slaughter. The smartest man in the ancient world essentially outsmarted himself. The trap sprang on an island of Cyclopes. Odysseus and a dozen of his best men were exploring a cave when the owner returned. Polyphemus, a one-eyed giant, rolled a massive boulder over the entrance. It was so heavy that 24 wagons couldn't have budged it. Then he grabbed 2 of the sailors, smashed them against the ground, and ate them raw. Odysseus knew that killing the giant in his sleep meant they would be trapped behind that boulder forever. So he waited. He offered Polyphemus heavy, undiluted wine until the giant passed out. Then Odysseus and his men heated a sharpened olive stake in the fire and drove it directly into the monster's single eye. When the giant woke up screaming, the other Cyclopes on the island ran to the cave and asked who was hurting him. Before getting him drunk, Odysseus had introduced himself by a fake name, Nobody. So the giant yelled back, "Nobody is hurting me." The other monsters told him to go back to sleep and walked away. In the morning, the blind giant rolled the boulder back to let his flock of sheep out to graze. He felt the back of every sheep to ensure no humans were riding them. But Odysseus had strapped his men to the bellies of the animals. They slipped right past the giant's hands and escaped back to their ship. They were back on the water. They had survived an impossible situation through pure intellect. If they had just kept sailing, Poseidon, the sea god and father of Polyphemus, would have never known who blinded his son. But Odysseus couldn't stand the thought of nobody getting the credit. As the ship pulled away from the coast, Odysseus stood up at the back of his boat and screamed at the blinded giant. He shouted his real name. He shouted that he was the son of Laertes. He shouted that he was the king of Ithaca. Now the giant had a target. Polyphemus prayed to Poseidon to curse his attacker, begging his father to ensure Odysseus never made it home, or if he did, that he arrived late, broken, and completely alone. Poseidon heard the prayer. Because he couldn't control his pride for 5 minutes, Odysseus voluntarily handed the god of the sea the exact coordinates needed to destroy his entire fleet. The curse took hold almost immediately. A friendly king gave Odysseus a leather bag containing all the dangerous winds, leaving only a gentle breeze to push them home. After 9 days of perfect sailing, the fires of Ithaca appeared on the horizon. Odysseus fell asleep, and his exhausted crew, convinced the bag was full of gold, ripped it open. The exploding winds blew all 12 ships entirely across the sea. From there, his assets were systematically eradicated. The fleet sailed into a narrow, rocky harbor surrounded by cliffs. It was an ambush. A tribe of giants called the Lystragonians hurled boulders down from the heights, smashing 11 of the 12 ships to splinters and spearing hundreds of men in the water. Only Odysseus's ship escaped. His tactical brilliance was useless against divine punishment. He was forced into impossible choices, like navigating a narrow strait between a massive whirlpool and Scylla, a 6-headed monster. To avoid losing the whole ship to the whirlpool, he had to sail close to the beast, listening to 6 of his own men scream his name as they were eaten alive. The final breaking point came on the island of Thrinacia. Bad winds trapped the starving crew for a month. While Odysseus slept, his desperate men ignored his strict orders and slaughtered the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. The moment they set sail again, Zeus split their lone ship in half with a thunderbolt. Every remaining sailor drowned. Odysseus clung to the wreckage and eventually washed ashore on the island of the goddess Calypso. He spent the next 7 years trapped there. He had no ships, no crew, and no authority. He spent his days sitting alone on a beach, crying. The man who cracked the walls of Troy ended up weeping on a foreign beach, his fleet gone and his men dead, all because he couldn't keep his name to himself. When he finally reached Ithaca, 20 years had passed since he left for the Trojan War. Poseidon's curse was fulfilled to the letter. He arrived late, his fleet was gone, he was alone, and his palace was occupied by 108 hostile suitors, drinking his wine and trying to force his wife, Penelope, into marriage. The old Odysseus would have stormed the gates, screaming his name and demanding his kingdom back. But 2 decades of suffering had taught him restraint. With the help of the goddess Athena, he disguised himself as a withered beggar to infiltrate his own home. Inside the grand hall, the suitors treated him like garbage. They mocked him, hurled insults, and one even threw a footstool at his head. Odysseus took the abuse in complete silence. He watched, counted the men, and planned, perfectly maintaining his cover. His hardest test wasn't the physical abuse. As he walked through the gates, he saw Argos, the hunting dog he had raised as a puppy 2 decades earlier, lying neglected on a pile of refuse. The ancient dog wagged its tail, dropped its ears, and died. To keep his identity hidden, Odysseus had to ignore his loyal friend and walk right past. Enduring that level of humiliation and heartbreak required complete emotional control. He finally understood that strategy sometimes requires total subjugation of the ego. When Penelope announced a contest to string Odysseus's great bow, the suitors failed to even bend the wood. The disguised beggar asked for a turn, casually strung it, and fired an arrow clean through 12 axe heads. Then he turned the weapon on the suitors. He and his son locked the doors and executed all 108 men. Even after the bloodbath, Penelope was cautious. She ordered her servants to move the king's bed out into the hall. Odysseus stopped them, explaining that one of the bedposts was a living olive tree rooted entirely in the ground. He had built the room around it himself. He didn't pass this test by bragging about his military conquests or his divine encounters. He passed it with a quiet, intimate detail that only a husband and wife would share. The Odyssey endures because it proves that tactical brilliance is worthless without self-control. Odysseus outsmarted monsters and gods, but his absolute greatest victory was finally learning to keep his mouth shut.